Concord streets. These are pictures I took in the 1970s of life around Concord. I was stationed at the time at Anderson Photo, and there was one thing that was a common denominator, is that life around me was always fascinating. I was equipped with a Nikon and took pictures of just everything I could take pictures of. It seemed like the only thing to do. There were so many people in such beautiful light, but there was an appreciation in my heart for all of Concord because my family came from Concord. We were merchants in the middle of town, and around the middle of town were all the people of the town. And that's what this picture show is all about. My father's photography shop catered to a crowd of people that were interested in a new, evolving photography field. Cameras, films, processing, everything was becoming mainstream. People had been taking pictures for years, and my father only set up a camera shop across the street from Richardson Drugstore that had been a purveyor of Eastman Kodak processing. But the photography store offered some more aspects of understanding about cameras and developing and options. Always options, but more than options, there was always education, teaching people to see light, subject, focus, all of these things. It was an educational concept as much as a sales concept that supported my family's growing up. We had a house around the corner on Hubbard Street, and my father, just about all of my memory of my father was that he would go out the house, down around the corner by the post office, by Ford Motor Company, and into his shop. His father's shop and grandfather's shop and a grocery store run by his brother David was Anderson Market, was across the street. We literally had a presence in the Concord downtown, period. My father shot photographs of every year at Fenn School, and although these pictures are all rather rapidly passing, there is more detail and interest in who. But for the sake of this picture show and of my own diligence, it was the passing of myself through space to capture images of Concord that was so compelling, because some of the subject matter had more than aspects of the seasons. There were houses that had been occupied by authors, writers that were famous, and that these houses were legends, as well as the Old North Bridge and the battleground of the Revolutionary War. In my life, there were so many things that had become greater than because of the legends that I naturally assumed this was the way life was. But okay, so I can talk about that forever. It was the idea that only what you took a picture of was something that you saw, whether it was a legend or not, and that it was a way of capturing light and moment and feelings that were astonishing. And my generation perhaps was not as legendary writing, but writing was started to devolve because of television and of image making. Pictures were an extraordinary thing and very powerful, no matter how flippantly we dealt with it in the shop, which was not very flippantly, because pictures are life and pictures are death. Sooner or later, everything comes to pass, and you develop a certain philosophy about why things are what they are, and you can disagree with them, or you can disregard the aspects because of the permanence of the moment is so astonishing, and capturing the moment is so astonishing, that the idea that these people, many of whom have lived their life in fullness and are no longer living on earth, their children are, or at least their houses are, or the telephone poles down the street are. Many of the trees still are, but the history of the moment flows by so rapidly that it does not matter to make a point about it, because it is just the way it is. It is life itself. For that reason, I will not point out names of people or anything except for the moment. Each sort of second that I was able to get the camera to the eye was capture things that I just thought were interesting, and interesting for content, interesting for legend, interesting for design, interesting because of the profound quality of nature. For this was Concord, where Emerson wrote his first book called Nature, and his subsequent, a friend, 15, 16 years younger, Henry Thoreau, wrote his books. And at that time, it was like my time being the atomic bombs have been dropped post-World War II, and that we lived under the aegis of the Cold War, and high technology was all around Concord, and it was different than a transcendental moment 100 years earlier. It was different because my father was a veteran, that he had served with the military, United States Marines, and that now we had lived through the 50s into the 60s and 70s with all the trauma that came with the assassination of Kennedy, and that things were different. We could make a grasp at the past, but we were just grasping at something that was hopefully going to hold us, share the burden of life. But that's not the case. The case is weather, the case is evolution, progress. The old goes out and the new comes in such a fashion that we were just preparing ourselves to be completely confused by subsequent decades of knowledge and advancements, the beginning of the digital age was upon us, and that computers were about to become profoundly smaller and smaller and control our lives in a way that the human interface, the knowing the people in the community, the talking, the ways that people did things, human ways, human interaction, was about to be wiped off the planet by a overwhelming blanket of social apps and digital information. People are hanging on by the very skin of their teeth. Well, looking back to the old days, and these aren't the old days are the 30s and the 20s, but looking back to the 60s and 70s, and these are 70s, something is not important. A dog walking down the street is not important, but everything is very important. These are the aspects that ensured our well-being and made us feel like life was to be lived, and lived we did, and people died, and we appreciated the show. Nothing was out of control. I was asked not to take pictures of those guys, but you know me, I prefer a snowstorm and the river, a constant thing that I photographed in the town, Concord, Massachusetts, where I was born. The golden era was brief, from 1971 until 1977. So much that was given to me in my later 20s, and my appreciation was unbounded, and it was all before my accident, which happened in 1977, at which time I went into years of reassigning, rebirthing, redoing, figuring out how to be capable on my own again. And then suddenly, from being 30, I'm 70, considerably older, and I can look now at Concord as an interesting place, but the Concord of my 70s is the one that I really love. That was what you're looking at. Those were the days. Anderson Market had a vegetable counter outside, and it had evolved for years. And the trees, I always loved the trees, and the personages, and the barber, of course. From our point in the middle of the village, I was able to run out about and take pictures every once in a while. But of course, there were many, many, many more pictures that are tucked away here and there, and some of these pictures are reproducing. Shall we say they are 5 little slideshows that have been stuck together for this monologue. And so you have to think, well, is he cracked, or is he doing something purposefully? Well, of course, the most amazing thing about pictures is seeing them again. Seeing them in the context of the words always changes the picture, changes the meaning of what you are watching. And so it goes. Each day I was at work. Each day I was taking a picture of something. And these are the pictures of that something. Because of my transit as a photographer, a gift from my father, I was also gifted by my grandmother, who was a Thoreauvian photographer, heavily inspired by N.C. Wyeth, who was also totally obsessed by Henry David Thoreau on his own level. He wrote a book, Men of Concord, and so it is. My grandmother wrote a book, Thoreau Country, in which she dramatizes her interpretation of Henry David Thoreau, which is not too far different than N.C. Wyeth, but it was about, as she was a photographer, it was about light seeing. Light is what gives us the subject of photography, and her moment began when Kodachrome began, and so her work, which was gifted to me as a muse, is color, and an intense, beautiful Kodachrome unequaled in the history of capturing light in photography. And so I urge you to look for my copy of Thoreau Country as best I could preserve it for Esther Howe Anderson Wheeler, or Esther Howe Wheeler Anderson, as it goes. My father's William Wheeler Anderson, and I am William Wheeler Anderson Jr., and I grew up in Concord. And these people, and these places, and this sky, these trees, these are the natural part of my being. Nothing more, nothing less. I love my world in Concord, Massachusetts. The moment is not unique. It is generational. And I have children and grandchildren, and they will take forth that which is important to them, and they will have something of me, of my father, of my grandmother, of my family, of my mother's side of the family, technology, mathematics. What is it? It is a consciousness. We are conscious of that which we are. Photography is a consciousness. It is not just sliding through. It is beginning to see that there is something good about how we slide through, how we see, how we think about things. People, independent-minded, desirous of freedom and love of earth,